I'm 43 years old, a carpenter. Since my divorce, life has shrunk to work, sleep, and the same Thursday trip to the pharmacy for heart medication. The only light in that beige waiting area is Claire, the technician with the tired smile and twin 5-year-old girls who color in the corner. I never thought she noticed me. Then last week, Rose walked up and whispered, "Mama says you're the best medicine." My hand froze. Claire's face shifted from embarrassment to raw fear, the look of someone whose deepest secret had just been spoken out loud. I didn't know then, but I'd later learn the whole backstory. She was a widow. Her husband had died of the exact same heart condition I was managing, and without realizing it, my routine visits, my quiet voice, had become a lifeline. She'd been telling her little girls bedtime stories about a man who fixed broken things. I was just a carpenter, a divorced man with a failing heart. But in her stories, I was something else entirely. I walked out of that pharmacy holding a paper bag and a question I couldn't answer. What do you do when you realize you might be someone's best medicine? That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the prescription bottle in my palm. Little white tablets, beta blockers. I was supposed to take one every morning to keep my heart from beating itself to death. That's what the cardiologist said after my ex-wife left, when the stress nearly put me in the ground. Your heart is a time bomb, and you've got to defuse it every single day. So every Thursday for 2 years, I'd walked into Milton's pharmacy on Cedar Street, handed over my insurance card, and waited. It was the only human interaction I had that wasn't about lumber or deadlines. The life of a divorced carpenter in a small town isn't exciting. You wake before dawn, you measure twice, cut once, you go home covered in sawdust, you eat something from a can, and you sleep, repeat. I'd convinced myself that was enough, that the silence in my apartment wasn't loneliness, it was peace. Then 8 months ago, a new technician started behind the counter. Her name was Claire. The first thing I noticed about Claire was that she didn't just scan my prescription and push a bag across the counter like the others. She looked at me. Actually looked. She read my name, asked if I had any questions about my medication, and when I said no, she smiled, not the plastic practice smile of customer service, but something tired and real. I remembered thinking, she's been through something. You can always tell. There's a weight in the eyes that doesn't lie. I didn't ask. I wasn't the type to pry. But the next week, I noticed more. The twin girls in the corner, maybe 5 years old, sitting on a blanket with coloring books and a box of crayons. One had a pink ribbon in her hair, the other a yellow one. They were quiet, well-behaved, and they watched me with curious eyes every time I stepped up to the counter. I smiled at them once, and the one with the pink ribbon, Lily, I'd later learn, hid her face behind her book. Rose, the braver one, stared right back and gave a little wave. I waved back. That was the beginning. Week after week, the rhythm became the same. I'd walk in, the bell above the door would chime, and both girls would look up. I'd wait my turn, make a comment about the weather or the traffic, and Claire would respond with 1 or 2 sentences. Nothing deep, but I started noticing things. The way her voice softened when she said my name, Mr. Hart. The way her hands, always busy, would pause just a second longer on the counter when I was there. The way she'd ask how my week was, and I'd say busy, and she'd nod like she understood the weight of that word. She never mentioned a husband, no ring on her finger. And the girls never mentioned a daddy. I assumed she was a single mom doing her best, and I admired that from a distance. I never imagined I was anything more than a polite customer, but I was wrong. One Thursday in late October, I arrived later than usual. The store was nearly empty. As I paid for my medication, the girls stopped coloring and looked at each other with a secret kind of excitement. Then Rose stood up, walked right up to me, and tugged on my jacket. I knelt down and she cupped her hand around my ear. "Mama says you're the best medicine," she whispered. Then Lily added without whispering at all, "She said you make the sad go away." I looked at Claire. Her face had gone pale, then crimson. Her hands were trembling. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. It was as if her own children had opened a diary she'd kept locked for years and read the most private page aloud. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood up, took my bag, and left. But I couldn't stop thinking about those words. A few days later, I found myself at the library, searching for information I had no business searching for. That's where I learned the truth. Claire's husband, a man named Daniel, had died of dilated cardiomyopathy 2 years ago, the same condition I was being treated for. He was 38 years old, an electrician who collapsed on a job site with no warning. There was a small obituary in the local paper and a photo of him holding both twin girls as Bobbies. He looked happy. And suddenly, everything made terrible sense. Every time I walked into that pharmacy alive, every time my heart was still beating, I must have reminded Claire of what she'd lost. But instead of running from that reminder, she had found something in it. A small anchor, a proof that not every man with a failing heart had to disappear. I thought about the bedtime stories she told the girls, about a man who fixed things, who was quiet but kind, who came in every week like clockwork, steady as a heartbeat. I wasn't a hero. I was just a carpenter with shaky hands and a tired voice. But in that little family's imagination, I had become something else entirely. A symbol, a piece of hope. And that realization broke something open inside me that I didn't know was still capable of feeling. I hadn't been anyone's anchor in a very long time. My ex-wife had made it clear I was too broken, too distant. But here was a woman who had silently chosen me without ever expecting anything in return. That kind of quiet, unspoken trust was more terrifying than any hard attack, because if I ruined it, if I ignored it, or pretended it hadn't happened, I wasn't just hurting myself. I was pulling the anchor out of a drowning family. The next Thursday, I got out of my truck and stood on the sidewalk outside Milton's pharmacy for a full 5 minutes. My chest was tight, and for once it wasn't the cardiomyopathy. I was holding a bouquet of wildflowers I'd bought from a roadside stand, daisies, purple asters, goldenrod, the kind that don't look like they cost a lot but feel like they mean something. I didn't have a speech prepared. I didn't have any guarantees. I was a 43-year-old man with a scar down his sternum and more failures than successes. But I also remembered what Rose had whispered. I remembered the way Claire's hands trembled. And I thought, maybe being someone's best medicine isn't about being perfect. Maybe it's about showing up. So I pushed open the door. The bell chimed. Both girls looked up. And so did Claire. The moment our eyes met, I felt every rehearsed line evaporate. Claire stood frozen behind the counter, one hand clutching a pill bottle, the other pressed flat against her chest. The girls, sensing something momentous, scrambled off their blanket and ran to their mother's side. Rose pointed at the bouquet. "Mama, look, flowers," Lily whispered. "It's the man from the stories." Claire finally found her voice, a thin, breaking thing. "Mr. Hart, I can explain," but I raised my free hand gently, cutting her off. "Is there somewhere we could talk, just for a minute?" There were no other customers. The pharmacist in back was an older woman who rarely left her stool. Claire hesitated only a second, then nodded and led me through a swinging door into a cramped break room smelling of coffee and rubbing alcohol. The girls stayed at the counter, Rose standing on tiptoes to peek through the gap in the door. I set the wildflowers down on a cluttered table among stacks of pharmacy receipts. I told her what the girls had whispered to me and that I'd looked up her husband's obituary. Her face crumpled, but I went on. "I know what it's like to feel your heart failing. I know what it's like to be left behind. And I don't know if this is crazy, but I couldn't stay away without knowing what you meant." She sank into a folding chair, tears spilling over. She told me everything, how Daniel collapsed so suddenly that she never got to say goodbye, how the girls kept asking when Daddy was coming home, and how she'd started pointing me out, just a quiet customer, as a symbol of survival. "I told them you fix things," she said, voice breaking. "I told them you were a carpenter because carpenters build things that last. I never meant for them to tell you. I never meant to drag you into this." I knelt in front of her. "You didn't drag me. I came, and I want to be here." That was the moment the fragile bubble we'd been living in began to crack, because the pharmacist, a woman named Dolers, had been listening at the door. And Dolers, it turned out, had a long-standing friendship with Claire's mother-in-law, Patricia. Within hours, Patricia knew that a strange man had been in the break room with Claire, that he'd brought flowers, and that the children had called him the man from the stories. Patricia had never approved of Claire. She'd blamed her for Daniel's death, convinced that Claire's neglect of his symptoms had killed her son. After the funeral, Patricia had started legal proceedings to gain custody of the twins, arguing that Claire was emotionally unstable and incapable of raising them properly. So far, the courts had seen no evidence. But now, Patricia had new ammunition. The next day, Claire received a letter from a lawyer. The custody hearing had been moved up, and a deposition was being requested regarding new and concerning influences in the household. The letter specifically referenced my presence. I got the call that evening. Claire's voice was flat with panic. "They're going to use you against me. They're going to say I'm exposing my daughters to some random man. They might win." I sat in my truck in the pharmacy parking lot, engine off, rain drumming on the roof. I realized then that my simple act of bravery had lit a fuse. I could walk away. I could go back to my silent apartment and let this woman fight her own battle. But the thought of never seeing those little girls again, of never knowing if Claire was okay, felt like a second, more permanent kind of heart failure. I told her, "Don't make any decisions yet. I'll come over tonight." She gave me her address. Claire lived in a small rental house on the south side of town, the kind with a sagging porch and a yard full of dandelions. When I arrived, the girls were already in bed, and Claire was at the kitchen table, a stack of legal papers spread before her. She looked 10 years older. She poured me coffee and spoke in a dull monotone. "Patricia has a lot of money. She hired a firm that specializes in grandparent rights. They're going to paint me as a broken widow who's delusional, who makes up fairy tales for her kids instead of facing reality. And now they'll bring you in and say I'm desperate for a man, any man." I put my hand over hers. "What do they need to prove?" She took a shaky breath. "That I can provide a stable two-parent environment. That the children have a father figure who's not just a figment of a bedtime story." The words hung in the air. Then she pulled her hand away, ashamed. "I don't expect you to. Maybe you should," I said before I could stop myself. Her head snapped up. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, speaking slowly as if I were explaining a carpentry problem. "Claire, I'm 43. My best years by most people's counts are behind me. I've got a dud heart and a job that breaks my back. But I know how to show up. I know how to be steady. If a marriage certificate is what it takes to keep those girls out of Patricia's hands, I'll give you that." She stared at me, mouth open. "You can't be serious," I nodded. "I've been alone long enough to know when something matters. You and those girls matter. This isn't a fairy tale, it's a legal chess move. But I meant what I said at the pharmacy. I want to be here, so let me be here in a way that stops them." The proposal was absurd, and she almost laughed. She cried instead. For a long minute she just shook her head, repeating, "I can't ask you to do that." And I kept answering, "You're not asking. I'm offering." Finally, she looked at the stack of custody papers, then at the closed door of her daughter's room. The weight of losing them, I knew, was crushing her. She whispered, "If we do this, it has to look real. Patricia will investigate every detail. There can't be any cracks." I squeezed her shoulder. "Then we make it real. We start now." And so, 3 days later, with 2 witnesses from the pharmacy who agreed to keep quiet, Claire and I stood before a justice of the peace and said, "I do." The only guests were Lily and Rose, who wore matching blue dresses and scattered flower petals they'd picked from the yard. They didn't fully understand. They just thought it was a party where Mama got to keep the carpenter forever. I slipped a simple gold band onto Claire's finger, a ring I'd bought with what little savings I had. And when I kissed her, lightly, carefully, I felt her tremble, not from cold, but from the terrifying gamble we were both taking. But here's the thing about gambles. You don't win them by playing safe. The very next week, Patricia's lawyer demanded a home visit from a court-appointed evaluator. The evaluator was a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Harding who asked dozens of questions about our courtship. She wanted to know how we met, when the relationship began, the nature of my interactions with the children. Claire and I had rehearsed our story. We'd been fond of each other for months, kept it professional, and only recently acknowledged our feelings. It was true enough. I showed Ms. Harding the room I'd prepared for the girls, complete with a handmade wooden bunk bed I'd spent nights building. I showed her the garden I'd started planting for fresh vegetables. I showed her the framed picture of Daniel that Claire kept on the mantel, proof that we weren't trying to erase the past. The evaluator left without revealing her opinion, her notes a mystery. We thought we'd passed the test, but Patricia had one more card to play. A week later, A certified letter arrived. It was from the State Pharmacy Board. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint that a pharmacy technician was involved in an inappropriate personal relationship with a patient, citing a conflict of interest and potential medication safety concerns. The complaint used my name and Claire's name. Dolers, the head pharmacist, was required to open an internal investigation, and Claire was placed on unpaid suspension pending the outcome. The letter made it clear, if the complaint was upheld, she could lose her license permanently, and without a job, without an income, her custody case would collapse. I stared at the letter in Claire's trembling hands. This wasn't just Patricia. This was someone inside the pharmacy, someone Claire had trusted. And now my presence in her life had become a weapon against her. The story had shifted. I was no longer the good medicine. I was the poison. Claire sank onto the sofa, the letter from the pharmacy board crumpled in her fist. She stared at the wall as if the whole world had just been pulled out from under her. I sat down beside her, my own heart hammering. "We fight this," I said. "There has to be an appeals process. Someone at the board will see this for what it is, a malicious complaint from a bitter relative." Claire shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. The board doesn't need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If Dolers testifies that she witnessed inappropriate contact, even just the conversation in the break room, they can revoke my license. And Dolers has been looking for a reason to get rid of me ever since I asked for fewer hours to be with the girls after Daniel died. She called me unreliable." That little detail hit me like a punch. The deck was stacked. Patricia had money, a lawyer, and now she had an ally inside the pharmacy who could destroy Claire's career with a single statement. I felt the walls closing in, but I wasn't going to let Claire see my fear. I took her hand and said, "Then we need to get ahead of this. We need to prove that the complaint was retaliatory and that Dolers has a personal vendetta. There must be records, emails, shift logs, something." It was a tiny sliver of hope, but it was something. Over the next 3 days, we dug through everything. Claire had kept meticulous records of every shift she'd ever worked, including notes about scheduling conflicts with Dolers. There was an email from 6 months earlier in which Dolers had written, "If you can't prioritize this job over your personal tragedies, maybe you should reconsider your career path." That alone was borderline harassment, but we needed more. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a young pharmacy assistant named Kevin who still worked the night shift. Kevin had always liked Claire. He was the one who'd covered for her when she had to leave early to pick up the girls. He'd heard Dolers on the phone with Patricia a week before the complaint was filed. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, seeing Claire suspended, he agreed to write a sworn statement. He described Dolers saying, "Don't worry, Patricia. I'll make sure she's out of a job by the end of the month." That was the smoking gun. We took everything to a lawyer Claire's father had known years ago, a retired family attorney who agreed to help pro bono. He filed an emergency motion to stay Claire's suspension pending investigation of the complaint's origin. For a brief moment, we felt like we were regaining ground, but Patricia had another move. She filed for an emergency custody order based on imminent danger to the children. The argument was that Claire's new husband, me, was a cardiac patient on multiple medications, with a documented history of depression and divorce, and that his presence posed a risk to the twins' stability. The petition included a copy of my medical records, obtained God knows how, with my diagnosis and a list of my prescriptions. Reading those private details in a legal document felt like being stripped naked in public. Patricia argued that I might suffer a heart attack and die in front of the girls, traumatizing them all over again just as their father's death had. It was a cruel surgical strike. The judge, a cautious man who'd seen too many messy custody battles, ordered a temporary evaluation. The twins would stay with Claire, but a guardian ad litem would visit the home weekly for 2 months to assess our fitness. One wrong move, one missed appointment, one moment of tension, and the girls could be taken away. I stood in the kitchen that night, the weight of my own body feeling like a liability. For the first time, I questioned whether staying was an act of love or selfishness. Claire found me there at 2 in the morning, staring at the prescription bottles lined up on the counter. She didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped her arms around me from behind and pressed her cheek against my back. I could feel her tears soaking through my shirt. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I pulled you into my mess." I turned and held her. No, I walked into that pharmacy every Thursday for 2 years. I kept coming back. I chose this. But even as I said it, I wondered if I was strong enough to be what she needed. The following week, the guardian ad litem made her first visit. Her name was Mrs. Crossley, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and a clipboard full of checklists. She interviewed each of us separately. She watched how I interacted with the girls. I showed Lily how to hammer a nail into a scrap board I'd set up in the yard. Rose asked me to read her a story, and I sat on the floor, my voice soft, reading about a rabbit who got lost and found his way home. I saw Mrs. Crossley making notes, but I couldn't tell if they were good notes. At the end of the visit, she said, "I'll be back next Tuesday." No hint. No reassurance. The tension was unbearable. Then came the night everything nearly fell apart. I was in the shed behind the house, sanding down a wooden chest I'd built for the girls' toys, when I heard Claire scream from inside. I ran in to find Lily on the kitchen floor, her face blue. She'd found a bottle of my heart medication that I'd foolishly left on the counter, the child-proof cap not fully screwed on. She'd swallowed 3 pills before Rose saw and ran to Claire. I froze for a split second, my own heart seizing, then scooped Lily up and rushed to the car. Claire sat in the back, holding Lily, crying and begging her to stay awake. I drove like a madman to the emergency room, running red lights, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. At the hospital, the doctors pumped Lily's stomach. They said she'd be okay. The dose wasn't lethal, thank God, but the incident automatically triggered a report to Child Protective Services. It didn't matter that it was an accident. In the eyes of the system, a child had ingested my medication, and that was a red flag. The very next morning, a social worker arrived at the house. She took photographs of the kitchen, asked about medication storage, and made a note that we'd failed to keep hazardous substances out of reach. Mrs. Crossley was informed. The emergency custody hearing was fast-tracked. I sat in the courtroom with Claire, my leg bouncing under the table, while Patricia's lawyer painted me as a negligent risk. "The respondent's own medication nearly killed a child," he said. "This is not a safe home. This is a ticking time bomb." Claire's attorney argued that it was a one-time mistake, that we'd since installed a locked medicine cabinet, that I was devastated by the accident and had taken full responsibility. But the judge's expression was grim. She scheduled a final ruling for 2 weeks later, and until then, the twins would be temporarily placed with Patricia. I'll never forget the sound of Rose and Lily crying as a court officer led them away. Rose kept reaching for Claire. "Mama, don't let them take us." Lily, still pale from the hospital, just wailed. Claire collapsed against me and I held her up, my own legs barely holding. For the first time since that Thursday in the pharmacy, I truly understood that my presence hadn't been medicine at all. It had been a disease. But sometimes, when you hit absolute bottom, you find something you didn't know you had. That night, alone in a house that suddenly felt like a tomb, Claire and I sat in silence for hours. Then Claire stood up and went to the closet. She pulled out a box of Daniel's things, his old work jacket, his union card, a stack of letters he'd written her when they were dadding. She held them to her chest and wept. Then she looked at me with a strange, fierce light in her eyes. "Daniel wouldn't have let them win," she said, "and neither will we." She opened one of the letters and read aloud. "If things get hard, don't run away. Find a way around. There's always a way around." That was the moment our strategy shifted from defense to offense. We'd been losing because we kept letting Patricia define the fight. We needed to define it ourselves, and we needed allies. The next morning, Claire and I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pot of coffee. We weren't going to wait for the system to crush us. Patricia had made her play, now we'd make ours. The first step was to call Kevin, the night shift assistant who'd already given a statement about dolars. When he answered, his voice was nervous. "They're watching me here," he whispered. "Dolars knows I talked to you. She cut my hours." I told him we just needed one more thing, any record of communication between Dolars and Patricia before the complaint was filed. He went quiet, then said, "There's a shared calendar in the back office where Dolars tracks everything. She's been marking days when Patricia called. I can take a picture. The next day, Kevin sent us a grainy cell phone image of a desk calendar. There were at least 6 entries over 3 months that said simply Patricia call or PW update. One entry, dated the day before the complaint, read, PW to file board complaint. Confirm Emhart's meds. That was the link we needed. It proved Dollars had colluded with Patricia to file a false report. We forwarded the photo to our lawyer, who immediately filed a motion to compel Dollars' phone records. But we still had the bigger problem, the custody hearing. The temporary placement had given Patricia the upper hand, and the guardian ad litem's report was due in 5 days. Mrs. Crossley had witnessed the empty house after the girls were taken. She saw Claire's grief, my guilt. We had to show her that we weren't broken, we were determined. So we invited her back for an unscheduled visit. When she arrived, she found a spotless kitchen with a new locked medicine cabinet mounted high on the wall above the refrigerator. I had installed it myself, bolted into the studs. I'd also completed a child safety course online and printed the certificate. Claire had enrolled Lily and Rose in counseling, even though they weren't with us, so the therapist could document the emotional damage of separation. We showed Mrs. Crossley the therapy intake forms, the new safety measures, and a letter from my cardiologist stating that my condition was well managed and that I was fully capable of providing care. The visit lasted 2 hours. At the end, Mrs. Crossley finally gave a hint of approval. She wrote something on her clipboard, then looked at us and said, "I've seen many families fall apart under pressure. You two are fighting for each other. That matters." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, the same day I used to pick up my prescription. It felt like the universe was drawing a circle. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, smelling of old paper and floor wax. Patricia sat at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, a silver-haired man in a sharp suit. She looked confident, almost smug, but I noticed her hands were clenched in her lap. Claire and I sat with our attorney, a retired lawyer named Mr. Donovan who had known Claire's father decades ago. He was slow-moving but sharp as a tack. On our side of the gallery, a handful of supporters. Kevin, who'd risked his job to be there, a few of Claire's neighbors, and even the old pharmacist from Milton's who'd worked with Claire before Dollars took over. The judge, a woman named Judge Hayashi, began by addressing the temporary custody arrangement. Patricia's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of a chaotic household where children were at risk. He brought up my medication, the hospital visit, and my divorce. He called me a transient figure with no real commitment. Claire's hand found mine under the table. Then Mr. Donovan stood up. He started slowly, asking simple questions. Who had been Lily and Rose's primary caregiver since birth? Claire. Who had maintained a steady job, a home, and a consistent routine? Claire. Who had rushed Lily to the hospital within minutes of the accident? Me. And who had called the pharmacy board to file a false complaint? He turned to Patricia. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Whitmore, that you encouraged Dollars to file that report?" Patricia denied it flatly. Then Mr. Donovan introduced Kevin's photo of the calendar and a sworn affidavit. He read the entry aloud. PW to file board complaint. Confirm Emhart's meds. Patricia's face went pale. Then came the medical records leak. Mr. Donovan had subpoenaed Patricia's phone records. He presented evidence that someone in her household had accessed a private medical database through a distant relative who worked in hospital billing. There was a time-stamped query for my name and date of birth 2 weeks before my records appeared in the custody petition. Patricia's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled. Patricia's carefully constructed image of a concerned grandmother shattered. And then, the final blow. Dollars had been called as a witness. Under oath, and facing potential perjury charges for the false complaint, she crumbled. She admitted that Patricia had promised her a financial bonus if Claire lost her job, because Patricia wanted Claire completely isolated and desperate. Dollars even confessed that she'd exaggerated the break room conversation to make it sound inappropriate. "I just thought if I helped get rid of the man, Claire would crack," she said, crying. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Hayashi called for order. When Mr. Donovan rested his case, The judge took only 20 minutes for a recess before returning. Her voice was steady. She ruled that the complaint to the pharmacy board was retaliatory and ordered it expunged from Claire's record. She vacated the temporary custody order immediately, citing Patricia's pattern of manipulation, false statements, and misuse of legal processes. She awarded full legal and physical custody to Claire and noted that I had demonstrated consistent and genuine commitment to the children's welfare. Then she looked directly at Patricia. This court exists to protect children, not to serve as a weapon for family vendettas. Your actions have caused significant emotional harm. Be grateful I'm not referring this for criminal investigation. Patricia's lawyer packed his briefcase in silence. Patricia herself walked out without a word, her heels clicking on the tile like a fatting heartbeat. Outside the courthouse, Kevin was waiting. He told us that Dollars had been suspended pending a full investigation and he'd been asked to take over as interim head pharmacist. He was grinning. "The board is cleaning house," he said. "You're coming back, Claire." Claire hugged him so hard he turned red. The neighbors cheered. But the moment I'll never forget came half an hour later when a social worker brought Lily and Rose to the courthouse steps. The girls ran toward us, their small legs pumping, their faces streaked with tears. Rose threw herself at Claire, sobbing. Lily, quieter, stopped in front of me. She looked up, her little face serious, and held out her arms. I knelt down and she wrapped them around my neck. "Don't go away again," she whispered. "Promise," I choked. "I promise, I'm not going anywhere." Rose pulled away from her mother and looked at me. "Does this mean you're our daddy now?" I looked at Claire, who nodded, her own eyes shimmering. "Yeah," I said, "if you want me to be." Rose didn't hesitate, she hugged me too. That evening we went home, our home, the little rental with the sagging porch, and Claire cooked dinner. The girls were in the backyard chasing fireflies. I stood at the window watching them and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. Not obligation, not survival, but a real warm certainty that this was where I was supposed to be. Claire came up behind me and slipped her hand into mine. "You know," she said softly, "when I told the girls you were the best medicine, I was just trying to explain why I felt better on Thursdays. I never imagined it would lead to this." I turned and looked at her. Neither did I, but I'm glad it did. And there, in the kitchen of a house that had almost been broken, we kissed. Not the careful, tentative kiss of a courthouse wedding, but the real thing. The kind that seals a promise. But the story doesn't end there. Because winning the battle was only the beginning. What came next would test us in ways we never expected, and reveal a truth about family that I had spent my whole life running from. The fight had taught us to defend our home. Now we had to learn how to fill it. We learned to fill it slowly, the way you learn to breathe after almost drowning. The girls went back to school. Claire returned to the pharmacy under Kevin's new management, her suspension lifted and her record cleared. I kept showing up, not just on Thursdays but every morning, medication in one hand, a hammer in the other, building a life plank by plank. Patricia eventually stopped fighting. She moved to another town, and the last I heard, she was living with a sister who didn't ask many questions. Some battles don't end with a handshake, they end with silence. But the silence in our house now is the kind that holds laughter in its folds, the patter of small feet, the smell of pancakes on a Saturday morning. It is the silence of a heart that has stopped panicking long enough to feel full. Looking back, I think about the strange geometry of survival. A man with a bad heart walks into a pharmacy to pick up pills. A woman behind the counter sees in him the ghost of a husband she lost to the very same condition. Instead of turning away, she tells her daughters a story about a carpenter who fixes things, who returns every week, steady as a pulse. And those daughters, too young to understand the cruelty of odds, whisper the truth out loud. They become the bridge between two lonely people who had forgotten that medicine isn't always a tablet. Sometimes it's a voice. Sometimes it's a hand reaching across a counter. Sometimes it's a bouquet of wildflowers on a Thursday afternoon. I still take my beta blockers. My heart is still a time bomb, technically. But time has a funny way of stretching when you have something to live for. Lily and Rose call me Dad now. They asked permission first, holding a little cardboard card they'd colored with a drawing of our house and 4 stick figures. I cried that day. Claire tells me that Daniel would have liked me, and I choose to believe her. I'm not a replacement, I'm an addition. And that is the lesson that took me 43 years to learn. You don't have to be someone's first chapter to be their best ending. You only have to show up and keep showing up even when it's terrifying. As for this story, it's still being written. Every morning I wake up, take my pill, kiss my wife, and listen for the sound of two little girls already plotting their next adventure. It is not a fairy tale. It is a real, messy, beautiful, hard-won thing, and it began with a whisper. So if you are standing on the porch of your own life, wondering whether to knock, wondering whether you have anything left to offer, let this be your answer. Sometimes the best medicine is simply being there. If this story meant something to you, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We share real stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary reasons to keep going. And if you have a story of your own, a moment when you became someone's anchor without even knowing it, tell us in the comments below. You never know whose life might be saved by reading it.